you have to make certain that there's been a lot of confusion about losses, and people have used the dinar, the basic currency unit of Iraq, and assumed they were American dollars, and of course that gives you a highly distorted view. I've seen several reports fairly recently in which that sort of mistake was being made.
Well,
but all I can tell you is that no such numbers of any order of magnitude of the type you are discussing came to the attention of the Federal Reserve.
This is based on that award-winning article in Vanity Fair, or the team who have won.
This way. Award-winning doesn't necessarily.
Well, I mean Jim Bartlett and Don Bartlett and Jim Steele, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists. I'm sure you know their work. But Naomi Klein?
Well, I would just add that it's quite surprising, actually, that Mr. Greenspan is unaware of the scandal around Iraq's missing billions, because Paul Bremer had to testify before Congress and was asked directly about those missing billions. It's been the subject of very high-level investigations. There's a huge paper trail around it, so this is hardly a secret, and it's hardly just a matter that's confined to Vanity Fair. This is.
Well, I'm not saying that the losses are not real. I think they are, because obviously we can't account for all the oil revenues. I'm just merely saying it's not something which was directly related to any of the actions which the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, to which we were referring, was involved, as far as I know.
That was the former Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan speaking on Democracy Now! Last month. For response, we are joined by that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalistic team, the authors of the Vanity Fair piece, Don Barlett and Jim Steele, two of the nation's top investigative journalists, joining us from Philadelphia, where they live. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jim and Don. Don, why don't you begin your response to the former head of the Fed, Alan Greenspan?
Good to be with you, Amy. One of the problems is that Mr. Greenspan speaks in a language that is unknown to most of us. He's done this for years in a kind of economic doublespeak, which goes unchallenged. But in this particular case, Mr. Greenspan is flat wrong. Jim obtained a lot of this information, which came from Mr. Greenspan's Federal Reserve Bank.
I mean, one of the things it's hard to decide where almost to begin to talk about this comment of his. He talks about confusion. One of the most significant things that's part of this whole process, the fact that they don't know where this came from, where these numbers came from. All of these numbers from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is if not a branch, it's certainly a part of the Federal Reserve System, which Chairman Greenspan headed for so long. And the Federal Reserve Bank of New York provided these to various U.S. government agencies, various congressional committees. There are literally thousands of pages of documents that led to the statistics that we used in our article, which was that basically $12 billion was shipped in this 14-month period. And on the one day in particular, you mentioned the $2.4 billion. All of that is out of records of the Federal Reserve System. So the Federal Reserve System certainly was intimately involved in processing this cash from the very beginning. Once it got to Iraq, which is the point we made in our story, that's where everything vanished, where there was absolutely no oversight, where there was no follow-up, and the idea that this went into creating a viable system over there is almost comical, because when you look at some of the records in Iraq, you see that much of this money went to the Ministry of Finance, which in turn turned this over to various Iraqi banks. But exactly where it went from there, nobody to this day knows.
And Jim, is it conceivable to you that Chairman Greenspan would not know about the $2.4 billion that on that particular day and the inability to track it afterwards?
We're speculating on this, but just based on what he said, it sounds to us that he did not know about this. And but again, as I think Naomi made the point earlier, and we certainly made it in the article, this is not exactly a secret. There's a substantial amount of documentation out there about those transfers. They're listed by day, and that's why we were able to make the statement of the $2.4 billion transfer on that June day back in 2004. That was the largest single transfer of currency in the history of the New York Fed, and indeed in the history of any branch of the Federal Reserve. So
How could Alan Greenspan, who at the time was the head of the Federal Reserve, not know about this transfer?
Your guess is as good as ours on this one.
But I think an even bigger issue here, Amy, is that Alan Greenspan always speaks with great authority, often on areas and subjects he really doesn't have much knowledge in, but yet he has never, ever, when he was head of the Federal Reserve, was very seldom challenged. And this is one case in which he's put his foot in his mouth, because the Federal Reserve did indeed do all of the things that were attributed to them in the article. And there's nothing, as Jim indicated, there's a record of this. And there were also, I mean, there were a lot of emails back and forth between the Federal Reserve and the various agencies of the U.S. government. So the record is voluminous here. And for Mr. Greenspan to suggest it's something that there were confusing dinars and dollars is really disingenuous.
And Don Barlett, what about the company that was supposed to be monitoring this money, North Star, that you wrote about in your piece?
This is a really important one, and maybe a little historical perspective. If you go back through the 1990s, there was a mutual fund, so to speak, in the Bahamas called Evergreen Security, which was selling its certificates around the world, especially in the U.S. Chicago school teacher emptied out her retirement fund and invested the entire amount in that. Well, Evergreen Security had been run, for the most part, by Patrick Thompson, a resident of the Bahamas, for a long time. And it was nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. And in the end, more than 200 million disappeared. Well, it was to Mr. Thompson that this mysterious Thomas Howell in La Jolla, California, turned to create a company for him called North Star. And a few years later, lo and behold, North Star is retained by the Pentagon to make sure the money in Iraq, the 12 billion and billions more, does not go missing, which of course it did go missing.
When we looked into the background of North Star, come to find out this is not your normal accounting or auditing operation. Operates out of a private house in a suburb of San Diego. All attempts to interview the individual, Thomas Howell, who apparently heads North Star, failed. He would talk to us a couple times, but said that his hands were tied. The Pentagon would have to give him approval to talk, and they did not. We looked into other aspects of the operation out of this house. Turns out some of it's home improvement. One is supposedly international financial consulting, all very vague, all very, very mysterious. But what does it say to us about the way, in part, we run this war over there, that the Pentagon and the Coalition Provisional Authority turned to a company whose ostensible, one of its functions, running out of that address, is home remodeling, to supervise what's going to happen to billions of dollars being airlifted from this country to Iraq. It may be almost a metaphor for the way we run that whole operation over there.
And were you ever able to trace the way or the connection between these individuals at North Star and the contracting agencies in the government that gave them this contract?
No, the only thing that is crystal clear, and Paul Bremer insisted that this was a Pentagon arrangement and that he had no say over this whatsoever, and that North Star was basically a creature of the Pentagon in terms of supposedly tracking this money. And again, you're talking about a company set up by a person involved in a $200 million stock scam. It just raises all kinds of questions, you know, as to why the Pentagon would utilize such a resource.
So you have an accounting firm created by a mysterious La Jolla man, by an equally mysterious Bahama resident who specializes in setting up offshore entities used to launder money, concealing assets, avoiding taxes, a man who presided over a securities firm from which $200 million was disappeared. Don Barlett and Jim Steele, we already talked to you about this in our previous piece. How has the press followed up on this expose in Vanity Fair? Don.
This is interesting. I mean, North Star, the company's identity was hanging out there. It's been hanging out there for a long time. But basically, no one has looked at it. And it goes beyond the news media. It also goes to the heart of congressional investigating committees, of government nobody's interested. And that really raises red flags in our mind as to why you wouldn't be curious about a company assigned the task of making sure billions don't disappear, and they disappear.
Well, Don Barlett and Jim Steele, I want to thank you very much for being with us, for doing the piece in Vanity Fair, and for all of your work. The Pulitzer Prize-winning journalistic team speaking to us from Philadelphia. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. When we come back, we go back 40 years to the death of Che Guevara. Stay with us.
Aprendimos a quererte, comandante revolucionario. Yo, querido comandante, ¿qué te digo? Primero, mucho gusto, me llamo Rodrigo. Soy un producto del exilio, es el año 2005. Mi padre te seguían y yo sigo en lo mismo. Tu foto en mi casa, me recuerdo tu sonrisa. Un hijo de mi dicta, tu imagen en mi mente. Palabra consecuente, juventud rebelde. Comandante, compañero, guerrillero, hombre nuevo, médico del pueblo. Mi amigo, te respeto, eres modelo ejemplario, eres legendario. Y tú me enseñaste, todo se vive a lo diario. Es lo día a día, es lo cotidiano, como aprendimos a quererte, comandante Che Guevara, hasta la muerte. Che Guevara, con mi gente revolucionario. Querido comandante, desde Chicago, con mucho gusto te escribe Gonzalo. Con mi hermano hemos crecido con tu historia, toda la gloria. ¿Cómo sería si estuvieras vivo ahora? Hombre nuevo, a veces siento que no puedo pelear contra el sistema sin apoyo de mi pueblo. Bueno, la verdad es que hay poca resistencia dentro del país donde tengo residencia. 20 años en el ojo del huracán, país más rico en la historia y todavía hay desigualdad.
Comandante by Red Stars here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Juan.
Today marks the 40th anniversary of the death of one of the most influential figures of the last century, Latin American revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara. Born in Argentina in 1928, Che rose to international prominence as one of the key leaders of the 1959 Cuban Revolution that overthrew dictator Fulgencio Batista. After a period in the new Cuban government leadership, Che aimed to spark revolutionary activity internationally. In 1965, he led a secret Cuban operation aiding and training rebels in the Congo. 1 year later, Che was in Bolivia, helping to lead an uprising against the U.S.-backed government. On October 8, 1967, he was captured by Bolivian troops working with the CIA. He was executed 1 day later. Commemorations are underway today in Cuba, Bolivia, and around the world. Some 10,000 people turned out Monday for a ceremony in Santa Clara, Cuba. Che's daughter, Aleida Guevara, addressed the crowd.
I want to remember the commitment we all have in order to make our society stronger. Today, Latin America is starting to wake up and make all of our dreams come true. We have to be present and firmer than ever. That is the greatest homage we can make to our fathers and our loved ones.
Aleida Guevara, daughter of Che Guevara, speaking Monday in Havana. In a moment, we'll be joined by Latin American historian Greg Gangan. But first, Che in his own words. This is an excerpt of Che's address to the United Nations in December 1964.
Bestialidad. The bestiality of imperialism, a bestiality that knows no limits, that has no national frontiers. The bestiality of Hitler's armies is like the North American bestiality, like that of Belgian paratroopers and that of French imperialists in Algeria. For it is the very essence of imperialism to turn men into wild, bloodthirsty animals, determined to slaughter, kill, murder, and destroy the very last vestige of the image of the revolutionary or the partisan in any regime, that they crush under their boots because it fights for freedom. The statue of Lumumba destroyed today but rebuilt tomorrow, reminds us of this tragic story, of this martyr of the world revolution, and make sure that we will never trust imperialism in no way at all.